Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Latterly podcast. This is Arjun Sajdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life,
Be bold.
experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens. Our guest today has been on a virtual book tour over the past month, ever since the launch of his new book, The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. And he's been on a number of really well-known shows and podcasts because he's written a super gripping, funny, insightful book that will change any reader's perspective about the grocery store, and the way he wrote about it clearly shows how interested and invested he was and still is. He's actually already experienced high acclaim with his first book called Hellbent, which was the story of the Bikram yoga world. And now with The Secret Life of Groceries, he's once again sitting in the number one spot in the restaurant and food category and the retail industry category of books. Jay and I couldn't put this book down, and with Halloween a few days away, we couldn't think of a better guest to have for this episode, because there's some shit in here that is truly spooky, and I'm sure we're going to get into it. But just to give you some background, he spent 5 years writing this book, which is not that long considering how much work he put into it. I mean, he interviewed hundreds of people, from grocery store owners to marketers to buyers to sellers. He also worked behind the fish counter at a Whole Foods for a few months. He traveled to Thailand and has stories about the fishermen there and some of the modern day slavery that's still taking place. He hit the road with truckers who really have a pretty tough life. And he basically experienced every part of the grocery store supply chain. So when you look at the book, The Secret Life of Groceries, it's really the secret life of the people bringing the groceries to you. And remember, this book was written before the pandemic. So we certainly want to acknowledge him for taking the time to be with us and to do this with us. This is a really, really cool opportunity. So let's welcome Benjamin Lorr to the Rising Latterly podcast.
Hey, thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate being on.
Wonderful. So let's dig into it by talking about how and maybe why you entered this world. I mean, what got you there? You clearly have a knack for uncovering and exposing truths. So talk about the genesis and maybe your experience in Kenya and how that led you to this point.
Yeah, so there are probably 2 or 3 different entry points to the book. Because look, a book is a big commitment on the part of a writer. So you might have this flashbulb of an idea, and it might be very gripping in the moment, but you don't necessarily want to run and write a book until that flashbulb pops in like 4 or 5 different places in your life. So I think in general, I've always been interested in supermarkets. Like I gravitate towards them. If I'm on vacation, I'll check out the grocery store in Nairobi or in Paris or wherever I might be. For this book, there was a very kind of almost cliche beginning, because I think it's a trope that you've seen in film. That as an undergrad, I went and studied primates in Kenya with a researcher in the field. And this was in the middle of nowhere, Kakamega Rainforest, which at that time, this was 20 plus years ago, no running water, no electricity, there was no mail there. There was really no roads there. There was a road that led to a town, and then you would go by foot from there. It was pretty remote. And we were pretty detached. Yeah, detached. And I spent a few months there, going to sleep by the sounds of the rainforest, waking up to them, lantern light, whole 9 yards, doing wash with your hands, hand wash. It's solar showers, which means you just collect water and hope that the sun warms it up. And then I came back to the States and was wandering around a grocery store, and it was like a hallucinogenic, trippy level experience of being back amidst the splendor of a completely normal, banal grocery store in New York City. Like, this was way before Whole Foods existed, I think. Or it existed, but it was in Austin. Way before it existed in my life. And I was just overwhelmed by the splendor of it all, and the fact that I had taken it for granted as kind of a birthright of privilege and being jostled back and forth. And so I think it was a moment when I really became aware of just how much power there is in the grocery store and how it is a kind of stand-in for uh, a lot of American life and a lot of the kind of privilege that we take for granted. And so
Yeah.
that was like kind of the first light bulb. And I was always like, yeah, the grocery store, it's a really trippy place. I want to scratch the surface on that. But then to fast forward to actually the moment I knew I was going to write the book was in my last book, which, as you mentioned, was on the Bikram yoga world. And when I write a book, I try to go pretty deep into the research. So I did a lot of yoga for that book, and I was following around a number of yogis, trying to understand their appeal or why they were so drawn to this guy, character Bikram Chowdhury, who's a guru um, from Calcutta, and he certainly had this like very romantic appeal to American Western students, I think, who were very drawn to him. And I was trying to crack the code on like why, what was it about this dynamic?
Right.
And so I went to one of his teacher trainings and was hanging out there for about 9 weeks doing lots and lots of yoga. And in the middle of that teacher training, where people are basically just been doing yoga all day, they let all these trainees go to the grocery store to get supplies because we're like cooking for ourselves in our hotel rooms sometimes. And they went to Trader Joe's, and the yogis went crazy. Like it was like kids at an amusement park style, like eyes open, super grinning, like, and I was like, what? This is the second time I've seen this type of obsession. There seemed like this parallel between this like yoga cult that I was kind of working on and this larger food cult that I think had really hit my life back when I was growing up. Grocery stores were like shrug your shoulders, and now they were like capable of causing grown men to giggle like 14-year-old boys. Like I want to understand that. So those were the two ways I got into it.
No, that's definitely a trippy experience, as you said. And I'm sure when you walk into the grocery store after your time in the rainforest, you're like, wait a second, I have this much choice, I have this much control. There's like an illusion that you get when you walk into a grocery store around choice and control. And it's interesting because you also have a unique way of defining taste in the book. You talk about it in several different ways and how that leads to your identity. So it's interesting around that. And I know you spent a lot of time in the book on Trader Joe's, but before we get into that, I mean, talk about how you define taste, because it's like the taste that you can eat, like with your palate. There's a taste in your choice, and then there's like a taste that you're projecting out. And all of that is leading to an identity.
That's exactly right. I think you really summed it up, but it's just that, especially when we think about food, taste really exists on these three levels. I mean, there's obviously taste in the taste buds, and it is largely a pun to say, but then it also exists on this sense of discernment, and you have good versus bad taste in term, or this is something that tastes good, and this is something that tastes bad. And then there's like the socially determined taste, where it is that top-down level of, oh, this is someone with particularly good taste.
Right.
And somebody who is kind of kitschy or cheapy. And it all does go, I think I was really interested in why people make buying preferences. I mean, so much, this fast forwards to kind of the middle of the book, but a lot of food is just retail in general. It is perishable, so it's got unique handling qualities. But the way the supermarket operates is not that different than a Target, and a Target, of course, has expanded into groceries because it's a very reliable, steady stream of business. But it's the same retail dynamics. So I was trying to understand the structures that cause people to buy things, and unpacking the way that tastes exist in terms of self-expression seemed like a really important thing to understand. And the way that they're socially determined from both directions. So we demonstrate our taste outward in a way of asking, expressing ourselves, which is this very American, and you can trace it back to the romantic ethic in like romantic poets who are causing people to like, they're exhorting people to express their innermost being. Uh, to the side that it's also a learned expression from society. So I didn't talk to, I learned from an anthropologist who was studying how people made buying decisions. And in those decisions, people wouldn't really know whether they liked an item of clothing until not after they had tried it on and worn it, but until after they tried it on in front of someone else. And then
Right.
they decided that they liked the item. And you would think it would be very much the opposite, where like maybe you know, were disappointed by somebody's reaction, but you knew prior to that moment whether you liked it or not. But if you know, when you look back on how when people self-describe discovering that they like, it's this really counterintuitive thing. So that pivoting between those two forces, yeah, it seemed like something that I really wanted to kind of tease apart.
Yeah, I really like how you expressed at one point in the book the idea of an animal like a chicken transforming into food once it's been slaughtered and processed, and likewise that food, you know, undergoes its own transformation when it becomes a product, once it becomes branded and put on the shelf. And I think it's really I never thought about it. You know, I'm 29 years old now, so over the course of my entire life, I guess I've been living in an era where people have been using food as a product to kind of communicate their own identity and ideals to people in their social orbit. But something you pointed out to me in the book was that, you know, that we didn't always have that relationship with food. Food used to be food, not food first, not product first.
Yeah, and I think that that's really essential for one, thinking about just like how we, you know, self-reflective standpoint, how we are as humans, but also, and if we want to act as agents of reforming a system, we have to understand what we're actually doing when we're buying things. Because what has turned out is that very method of like self-expressing through food, which I think, by the way, is totally valid. Like people have always self-expressed through material goods. Like I walked into this, I think, very skeptical. Like I'm like anti-materialistic. I don't, you know, and I would never buy like a Rolex to like flaunt my identity. That seems so crass. But there are thousands of ways, you know, like I do collect vinyl records. I love them. That is obviously a way of me manifesting parts of myself for other people to like walk in and be like, oh, look at this great like Steely Dan album, blah blah blah. Right. So first, that caveat that I don't think there's anything distasteful about this,
Mm-hmm.
but it is easily subject to manipulation. And when you look at the system of certifications and audits that kind of form the backbone of things like fair trade, things like rainforest friendly, they often can deteriorate into something that is manipulating our ability to express ourselves, but not actually manipulating the substrate beneath that, which would be the people's lives that they're, or the rainforest they're there to protect, or the fair trade that they're there to serve. And so it's really important to remember that self-expression exists on two, you know, there's the expression through material goods, which is all valid, and then there's like expression between individuals and how you treat other people and how you act and how you behave, and they get pretty blurry in a market economy. But I think teasing them apart to the extent that you can, and thinking about how you create lines of supply that premise the second interaction, which is like, okay, I'm just going to manifest who I am by how I treat you and by how I like honor this relationship, is something that we need to steer back towards.
For sure. No, absolutely. And also when you put in context of the fact that like the biggest stores now have, you know, north of 120,000 SQUs or SKUs, I'm sorry, like these items, there's also when you think about the fact that back in like the 1800s, like 90% of the people that lived were working towards producing food, and now less than 5% of the population can create all the food for all of us. So the relationship between our food has changed, and that's why it's just like a product. and the way we look at it is definitely different than the way the industry looks at it. And you definitely dive into that. So as we go into this conversation a little bit deeper, I mean, you definitely spent a lot of the time in the book talking about Trader Joe's. And I think the way you were positioning it was more like they had a choice of how they wanted to go. They can either go down the route where most grocery stores are going, or they can be a little bit more exclusive and kind of stick to their brand. And it's not saying that they're doing it right or wrong, it's just that they were doing it different relative to the industry. So, can you dig into that?
Yeah. So Trader Joe. So yes, uh, Trader Joe's occupies like an interesting place both in the book and in the retail dynamic, in that it is not actually functionally equivalent to a lot of other grocery stores. They
Right.
made some decisions that, um, especially back in the 1960s when it was founded, that are different and that have consequences. Um, and I kind of wanted to highlight those because it provides some insight into the ways that the size of the system has changed to prevent um, those kind of the more humanistic and creative qualities that Trader Joe's was able to establish back then have been made more difficult. But to back up, like Trader Joe's started out as a fleet of convenience stores in Southern California, Pasadena area, Pronto's markets that were formed essentially as 7-Eleven imitators. And they were just plain typical stores of their day that bought exclusively from wholesalers, sold convenience goods. And the only difference really was that they were helmed by this guy, Joe Palum, who was an extremely eccentric, extremely decent, and extremely intelligent guy who kind of fell into groceries by accident, which is a whole nother story that's in the book. But essentially, he starts these Pronto markets to imitate 7-Eleven because he realizes 7-Eleven is gobbling up other regions' drugstores, so they must be onto something. And then 7-Eleven moves into town, and it's like 7-Eleven at that time is gargantuan, and he realizes instantly they're gonna like make him extinct because he can't possibly compete with a retailer that big. In particular, because in the convenience retailing market, size is almost everything. Size
Right.
and real estate position, and of course, real estate. You get the backing of the bank to sign on those lease agreements, and they're going to always sign with the bigger partner. So he felt like he was doomed unless he made a big shift, and that's what the shift that you're talking about. He could have sized up and tried to compete by growing bigger and bigger and bigger, which he just thought as I probably can't do this as like a lone dude running six
Right.
convenience stores. But if I could, would I want to compete on that? Because that's the one way everyone's competing right now. And I'm always going to have to be looking over my shoulder to worried about these other competitors. And even when I get to the top, it's very unstable. The market can only support 1 to 3 people at this place. Everybody else is, it's just an unstable present. You can see, he's very prescient in this, in that is our current retail market space with like Amazon
True.
and Walmart. And since his day, there has been a great winnowing in the amount of independent chains for exactly this reason. It's just extremely unstable if you're not gargantuan. And so he said, there's this another tack. I can try to, go lateral. I can try to compete with these places by either exploiting loopholes that their size doesn't allow them to get into, or by focusing on things that their size makes them lazy. And so, he kind of takes the opposite tack of shrinking down his offerings to a very human scale. So as you said, the average grocery store today probably has 55 to 65,000 stock keeping units or SKUs. That's individual items in the store. Even in his time, it was very close to that. Maybe it was like 45,000, 50,000 back then. But that's too much for a buyer to take a handle on. It's not a human number. So he shrunk that down to about 3,000 SKUs even less when he first started out. And then empowered his buyers to really take mastery over those supply chains, and simultaneously went and decided he was going to really demographically target. So rather than like an Amazon, Walmart approach, which is like, okay, we're going to serve everybody, and the way we're going to serve them is by getting big, 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 and making their lives as convenient as possible. He took like basically a proto Steve Jobs approach, which is like, I'm going to identify my consumer, and then I'm going to build things for them that they want, that they don't even really know they want, because I'm going to have such fidelity to the demographics of people that I envision as my consumer that I'm going to get to know them better than they know themselves. And that took a lot of guts because nobody was doing it at the time. And it took a lot of hard work because it's easy for me to say these things, but you got to actually go out and master the supply chain. You got to actually understand your demographic extremely deeply, and then you got to execute. And so, obviously Trader Joe's did that, especially under his helm. And so it's a success story, but it is this like kind of fork in the road that as an entrepreneur, he was faced with.
The other interesting thing he did was, focusing on hiring some college graduates as well. So he made that kind of an exclusive thing about Trader Joe's too. Is like they had smart people working there too. So that's all I wanted to add to that.
No, that's a great point. I mean, it's funny too in the book. So Trader Joe's paid their employees much higher than anyone else in grocery was paying them, and Joe had, I got the opportunity to interview him. He died in February this year, but I kept trying to like figure out why he made this decision early on. And he had a lot of justifications for it that I think they were all true to various extents. But when it really came down to, he was just like, yeah, life's too short. Like, I didn't want to work with people who are working at a 7-Eleven. I wanted to work with people who are really smart and who are responsive. And so I had to pay them more, and I had to employ from the top half of the job market. And I think there's just something awesome about that honesty. That really, it's not entrepreneur speak where you're like, he wasn't worried so much about the costs to be cut and, whether this was some big long-term strategy. He was like looking out for his day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think his kind of it sounded like his zest for life kind of bled into the brand with the fun ways he would title white labeled packages and the kind of witty aphorisms he would put on his products to appeal to that newly educated, expanding college demographic. So he just was, one of those entrepreneurs that had a vision and was really having fun. I think it read to me like he was having fun building this kind of new vision.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's something that I would have loved to explore with him more. He was a little like almost defensive about this stuff because I think he really wanted to be understood as a businessman first. Mm-hmm. And I think he was. And I actually take him at face value there. Like Trader Joe's had an enormous wine program that he invested gobs of hours and time into like learning about. And he is not a wine drinker. He was drinking like cooking sherry at home to relax. And yet he was like learning about like exclusive, French vintners and like terroir and tasting 60 bottles a day to like really gin up his knowledge of wine. And that was purely a business decision. At the same time, I do think that defensiveness exists for a reason. And it is something to be like interesting to think about it for those of us who want to like walk in that life. Like he did have a lot of fun with this and he did give himself over to this. And I don't think that he would have been able to be as successful or get the depth of knowledge that he ultimately got about those consumers if he wasn't at least able to walk in their shoes. Like he never held anyone in disdain. In fact, one of the key quotes in the book for me was like his wife told me, like, this guy is not a snob. Like he's brilliant. He's super smart, but he gives everybody the same amount of time when he talks to them, whether you're the CEO of a large company and Joe was consulting for boards to the end, or whether you are, just somebody who walked into a store and is really enthusiastic about wine. And that ability to like walk in somebody's shoes and it's a real interesting thing that I don't really dig into the book quite as much as I'd like, but I think it's really an important lesson that he kind of toggled both ways, from like businessman who is doing this for strategic purposes to like guy who is having a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as the book continues, you see how unique his approach was. I mean, at the end, we'll talk about how basically it's like a pay to play situation in the grocery world. And obviously, the whole Amazon Whole Foods merger, we can talk about that. But before we do that, I mean, one of the wildest parts about your experience was when you started riding in the truck with Lynn. And
Yeah.
the idea that our listeners may not understand how hard a truck driver's life is. We drive on the highway, we see the trucks, but we don't actually understand what's going on behind the scenes in terms of how hard their day is. The fact that they might be on paper making $200,000, but really going home with less than $20,000. And then the craziest part is how they recruit within the trucking industry. So this was another big chunk of the book that Jay and I really wanted to dig into because, again, for the audience, it's like, yeah, we go online and we order our groceries, or we go to the grocery store, and we don't really think about the life of the truck driver. So tell us about that experience a little bit, because you lived it.
Well, I lived in a dilettantish sort of way of riding along with this woman in her truck. But it was extremely eye-opening, as you said. I mean, so look, yeah, trucking, it's gargantuan. Everything that we touch, deal with in our lives is brought to us on a truck. And it's not hyperbole to say that. Like, that is a fact of American life, is that trucking is a backbone industry. It's the majority employer. It's the top employer in the majority of states, I should say. Something like 10.7 billion tons of freight per year, which breaks down to 350 pounds per day per person. So it's like you have 350 pounds of freight moving around on your behalf every day as a typical American citizen, which is like kind of mind blowing. Like, where did that come from? I didn't order 350 pounds of anything. But that's them's the facts, and I'm sure it's not totally equitably distributed because nothing in America is. But it is this like mammoth industry that operates in the shadows, and that I think we have an illusion of understanding about, because of course we all drive around and we pass truckers on the highway, and you're like, yeah, trucking, I get it. I've seen like Smokey and the Bandit and like some like 70s, gruffy but lovable portrayal of these like blue collar outlaws. Like, there's good guys, they'll help us fight the Nazis or whatever. Like, and the reality is that the profession has changed dramatically over the last 30 to 40 years. Like many things, and it is a theme in the book, where our race to efficiency has a lot of unintended consequences in labor in particular. And so in trucking, the truck driver really has become shifted from that middle class job into basically a disposable part of the industry. And wages have fallen tremendously. I think the stat that I use in the book is wages have gone, truckers are putting out, I think, 2 to 2.5 times the efficiency, like output in terms of efficiency, and are getting paid about 40% less for that, for doubling of the efficiency. And yeah, a lot of them, and this is, I cannot argue this case exclusively with the numbers, because nobody has really put together these numbers, because one, trucking is so vast, and two, it's so in the shadows. But I found a pervasive world of debt peonage in trucking. The truckers themselves would call themselves sharecroppers on wheels, and they would be lured into the industry by the promise of these middle class wages and the promise of kind of a lifestyle where they were in control. And to do that, they would take out loans to get their CDL, commercial truck driving license, or to become owner operators of a truck in a fleet. And as soon as they took out that debt to begin this lifestyle, it was then used by the companies who loaned them it as a threat to prevent them from kind of operating in a purely free market environment and being able to compete with between trucking companies, they were kind of beholden to the trucking company that provided them these loans. And yeah, the result was just as grim as debt peonage in any other place or time in history. People who were just getting bled, their paychecks were just getting bled and they were getting worked. So the woman I was with was working 70 plus hour weeks, and the week I was with her got $100 paycheck, just like bananas.
Yeah, certainly. No, it's the other day, I was chatting about this book with my friend, and I was trying to tell him, like, the trucking industry has between a 95% and 112% turnover rate. And he's like, dude, how can something have over 100% turnover rate? And I'm like, that's because they went through the industry and a little bit more.
Right.
And basically they figured out like how to make humans replaceable.
Yeah, and it gives you a sense of just how bad those jobs are. Like like the legal profession, like top law firms have like a turnover rate of like 17%, and that's like a crisis level. Like people cite that as like the legal profession is falling apart. Or like Starbucks might have, which is a job that may be comparable to a minimum wage trucking job if you think the trucking is should be a minimum wage job. That has like a 60% turnover rate. So trucking is doubling those pretty deemed extreme turnover situations. And yeah, one of the things that I talked about in the book, and that I do think, I talked to various activists and observers in the trucking world, and it does seem like that they are making money off this turnover because the new trainees are profitable. They can charge, they can lease them out or charge them for training rates and for their freight rates. So rather than pay them like an experienced driver at a higher cost, they get paid much lower rates per mile, and that goes right to the bottom line of cheaper freight. It's by the time they become experienced drivers and could get a higher rate, they have been either flushed out of the system because they realize these jobs are so miserable, or they're now encouraged to take on more debt to become owner operators of their truck, and then that is used as a way of manipulating them.
Yeah, and the kind of image that drove home Lynn's struggle for me was her Pepsi can. You recognize that she was drinking a ton of Pepsi, and only after spending a few days with her, weeks with her, did you realize that she was drinking for calories. So, to be drinking canned soda for calories and trying to get by on $100, or less net, is just an incredible life when you're working 70 hours a week and grinding that hard.
Absolutely. It's brutal. And I do think it all it ties together a lot of themes, although I don't make this explicit in the book, but yeah, it's like, in the book I talk about how she wants to go paleo, and it's like, could almost be read for laughs because it's like this absurd thing of this woman who's like literally drinking a half pack of Pepsi every day before noon. And that's like, and she's like, yeah, I really want to go paleo, as she's like smoking a cigarette and drinking some Pepsi. And you're like, okay. But also the reality of her life is such that there really isn't, it isn't actually a failure of her to understand what paleo is or lack the education. It's a lack of wherewithal. Like, she's in a job where there are no options. She's not going to places to eat and truck stops where that's a viable opportunity for her. Her job itself requires her to be sedentary, definitionally, and the amount of money that she's making puts a lot of limitations on her life. So it ties together a lot of how like our nutritional and dietary crises that people point out are really linked to economics, but in ways that not necessarily about dollars and cents. There are, poverty comes in a lot of different forms, from like the amount of free time you have to the amount of choices that you're able to be given. And I think the trucker story really anchors that.
Yeah, and it goes to show that it's just another person in the supply chain who could barely pay for the food that they're trying to provide. So,
That's right.
can you actually talk about like the pricing, the promo items, the whole idea around spending in the grocery store? Because that leads to this whole pay to play that we're kind of referring to earlier. Um, and also kind of leads to how you can have a different label of whether it's FDA approved or organic and all these different types of labels. I mean, do they even mean anything? What do they mean for the consumer? What do they mean for the supplier? What do they mean for the buyer? There's like layers to this journey to the shelf that I think is important to reveal to our audience as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's definitely something where my eyes were opened. I think so. To back up, grocery is by the supermarket. It from inception has been a volume game. It is a low margin, high volume industry, and that's how supermarkets make their money. Is not by um, creating like a high difference between what they're paying for the goods and what they're selling the goods for, but by just selling a shitload of product. And then with a 1% margin, they still can make a decent amount of money. And it's very much based on consistency. And of course, it's a pretty good sector of the economy to be based on consistency because we all got to eat. So
Exactly.
that works out, of course. And that's the mentality that I walked into the book with. It turns out that one, competition has gotten so fierce that they've kind of quietly reinvented their model in terms of how they're making significant amount of money. And it's this very tantalizing pay for play model where rather than worry about the exact mix of items on their shelves in terms of margin and like kind of jockeying you to select the high margin items or just to purchase a lot, they will charge young entrepreneurs prices to get onto the shelf. And it's not just I think I understood this was happening before the book in terms of end caps or like big displays that are kind of like big showy marketing displays. Yeah, I assume people were paying for those prominent places in the store, or maybe greasing it somehow one way or the other. But I'm talking about inches on the shelf anywhere for something like slotting fees, or for some stores they kind of become kind of gauche to talk about slotting fees in the industry. So they come at you for a pay-to-play fees in other formats, whether it's offering free caseloads of product or buy one, get one frees that are subsidized by the manufacturer, or quote unquote advertising fees for in-store advertising, which may not exist or exists in like some type of weird internal newsletter that's certainly not actually moving your product forward, but does have a hefty fee attached to it that you as an entrepreneur need to pay. And then if you pay it, you get to go on the shelf. So there's a lot of these fees, and they make up a big percentage of grocery income. I talked to the former head of grocery for Whole Foods National, and he called it crack, and he called it rocket fuel for the bottom line that all buyers were susceptible to. Because in this like very high margin jockeying for position, highly competitive world, if you can just get some young entrepreneur who doesn't have a business at all, if they're not on your shelf, to pay you some money directly, it'll juice those bottom lines.
Yeah.
And
Seems pretty ruthless.
It's definitely ruthless. I don't really have a position on whether it's good or bad, except for the fact that it is extremely opaque. It lacks the transparency that you need as an entrepreneur, like in a fair system, and that comes down on new entrepreneurs more than people who don't fully understand the system or are learning as they go learn really quickly and learn really hard lessons, or they need to team up with venture capital and have a big bankroll to unroll their product. And so it's fine if supermarkets want to reinvent themselves as simply a platform and act like landlords and lease their shelf space out. I think that's okay. I don't think the consumer necessarily benefits, so I think consumers would be interested in that. But there's nothing inherently wrong with it. What's wrong with it is just how opaque it is And honestly, if you talk to the guys on the inside, which I obviously spent a lot of time doing for this book, a lot of them are like, yeah, it is hard for us to know what an item costs. Like, we put a price on the shelf, but like where that comes from, if you want to start untangling all the fees and different like things that go into it, like there's no like formula that you just plug in. It's done very ad hoc and responsive, and people are kind of grabbing money when they see it. So if a product has a big few months, then they're going to come at you with some higher fees. You better believe it. And that part to me is troubling.
Yeah, and what it showed to me was that it's not always about which entrepreneur is coming to the table with the best product. It's such a complex web of incentives, as you've laid it out, that really, in a lot of situations, it's actually who's coming to the table with the most capital. You know, even if you have a great idea, if you don't have the money to pay all these kinds of licensing fees, chances are it's never going to make it to the shelf. So it made me think differently about the products I'm seeing when I'm walking through the grocery store, and wondering if maybe there actually is a superior product out there, but the inventor of it just didn't have the capital required to break in. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. And I think it does have consequences on the food chain for exactly those reasons. It makes it a system that is much less hospitable to small players who might be the real innovators in terms of, on all sides, in terms of like ethics. If there's going to be reform into our system, it's going to probably come from manufacturers who just have a natural ethical bent, kind of like Joe Kalum and Trader Joe's, who just wanted to pay his employees more. But it's much harder for those guys to get in the door. They have to play a game that venture capital approves, because they need the money from venture capital to pay into a pay-to-play system, and it all steamrolls efforts at kind of like smallholder reform, which is too bad, because to my mind, that is probably some of the more promising paths.
And it probably explains why you see, certain trends or certain fads, right? So once an ingredient breaks in, and you talk about it in the book, once an ingredient breaks into the supply chain, all of a sudden you see it across the board, right? So avocado oil is the example that you use. It starts out on popcorn, but next thing you know, it's in crackers, maybe it's in mayonnaise, and right. It's not by accident. So, I mean, there's levels to this, and I think that your book does a really good job of exposing that. The other thing your book does is expose how seafood gets to our table. And so your time in Thailand with the fishermen was an eye-opening experience for us as readers, because, it made me realize, like, wow, I've been at a cocktail party and I know I've said no to the shrimp before. And for me to say no to that shrimp in the future is like a crime against humanity, because the person who got the shrimp to my table, like, went through hell, and they didn't even get paid. So if you can talk about your story with, I think the character's name was Tun Lin, and just the fisherman story in Thailand is really something that needs to be shared.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I zoom in on Thai seafood because I think, one, there's been a lot of reporting on Thai seafood, so that it's possible to excavate out these human stories in a way for a book. But really, I came to think of Thai seafood as being a stand-in for a lot of commodities. And so let me back that up. It's the reality with most. Now, I don't know, most is a hard word to say. The reality with many commodities is that the supply chains to get them at a consistent volume for world appetites are so big and so complicated that visibility straight through them is almost impossible. And that's especially true with supply chains where there's lots of small holders like Thai seafood, which is somewhat ironic, I think, because I think one notion that a lot of good foodies hold into their mouth, in their mind, and maybe in their mouth, is that, like, these big evil companies, like, it would be so much better if we had a lot of like small farmers and like a lot of smallholder, small fishermen. That would be like a really better world. But in terms of policing a supply chain, it's a much, 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 much more difficult world, because they're spread out and democratized. And what happens is the raw materials get aggregated, they get transformed, the products of that transformation then get aggregated, and it all feeds up to several pretty high-level manufacturers who have a lot of trouble, again, with this visibility. So all that is background to Thailand. And I say that because I don't want people to be like horrified by Thailand and then think it's some exceptional product. I really think I came to believe that it was far more pervasive than exceptional. But yeah, the story in Thailand is horrific. It's about a migrant worker who essentially gets kidnapped during his journey to Thailand from Burma and is imprisoned on a boat that is, among other things, collecting trash fish, which is the protein base at the bottom of all aquaculture. So all the fish that we raise and all the shrimp are carnivorous. They need protein. Right now we cannot develop a substitute for that based on plants. In particular, actually, it's not just the protein, it's the fats. They need like omega-3s from the ocean, or that's certainly true for even though we're farm raising them, our extraction from the natural world is keeping pace, and since it's inefficient, it takes about 2 to 3 to 1 extract like fish from the ocean to make 1 pound of shrimp. It's the more the aquaculture grows, the more we need to extract from the oceans to feed the aquaculture, which is, again, not totally a knock on aquaculture. I think in many ways it's more efficient than a lot of other animal products that we make, but it is a reality. And so as aquaculture has bloomed, the demand on cheap fish has also boomed, and migrants in Thailand have been increasingly caught up in that boom, and there's structural reasons for that. These fishing boats go out to sea for long periods of time. They can be resupplied out at sea, which allows them to just hold people out there indefinitely, which of course is a recipe for abuse. Whenever like these structural things exist, if you have a democratized field with lots and lots of smallholders, you might have 80% that are really good people and like treat people, extremely decently. And then you have the 20% who are like bastards, and the bastards take advantage of it. And then figuring out who those are. His story is horrific in this, he was imprisoned, he was beaten for work, watched his best friend get killed in front of him. He loses his hand in the process, out at sea. But I think one of the most salient parts is that he finally gets off these boats after serving his time, and then he goes to work in a fish factory, packing fish, stripping fish off the bone, and there he gets scammed by his employer, who's withholding wages and kind of imprisoning him on site. And then he goes back to the fishing boats. This extremely unimaginably inhumane place. And I think it goes to show you just how pervasive this type of wage abuse exists in the lowest pockets of the supply chain. And I'm not doing a great job of laying into the details of how badly he was treated, mostly because it's like it gets so lurid so quickly that it's almost like I don't like to sensationalize it, but like the detail, as you know from reading, are brutal. And like profoundly troubling to think that they exist in our lifetime and aren't some like historical fact that we can dismiss, like, oh, we've evolved into better people now. It's like these are like just about as brutal conditions as you could imagine happening right now.
For sure. And again, the book is called The Secret Life of Groceries. I have a version on the Kindle, so it's not really nice to show on screen. Do you have one handy that maybe you can pop up? There you go.
There it is.
That's The Secret Life of Groceries. I know we're kind of getting close to the end here, but if you had to talk about maybe the one thing that needs to change in the industry, what would you like that to be?
Whew, I don't have a simple solution. I don't think that things changing in the industry are going to be the leading tip of the spear for change. I think change outside of the industry is going to be extremely important. So by what I mean by that is like, look, if we live in a globalized economy where we're outsourcing labor, then we need labor standards outsourced as well. And that can't be done with treaties that have no enforcement teeth. They have, to the extent that we have enforcement teeth in this country on labor standards, they need to be globalized as well in lockstep. Otherwise, you're just inviting this type of, you're tacitly condoning this type of abuse if you don't do that. And right now, that's what we do. We don't have trade treaties with very good enforcement teeth. So solutions like that, I think empowering workers is a really big, again, not something that is something I expect the grocery store to do, but unions have been decimated in this country. Figuring out ways that workers' voices and they can self-represent for and advocate for their rights, I think is crucial. I think that figuring out how to educate people so that they prefer brands that have authentic workers as stakeholders or shareholders within them is an idea that I've been toying with. I think right now the way that labor is set up, it's always going to be the cost that's cut. To become a global commodity, you need to jump through a lot of hoops. You need to be able to like meet this certification and that certification. You need to like sell at this price level. But labor is not one of those hoops that anyone has to jump through in a meaningful way. And that means that it's always the default cost to be cut when people are competing. So that has to change. And the only way I can see it changing in a long term is by actually creating a connection between the value that workers are putting into it and their pay. So making them actually shareholders in the companies that they work for, as opposed to just employees. But these are big shifts that are not things that I hold the supermarket manager accountable for. I actually think that your point of like, it's a crime against humanity for me not to eat this shrimp is like, there's a lot of truth to that. And I definitely hope that people come away with a greater appreciation of the bounty that they have, knowing the sacrifice and struggle that went into it. And of course, then don't stay complacent in that place, but then, think about how they want to like advocate for other people's dignity as well.
That was the beauty of having you on with us. I know you have more things to do in terms of more interviews and things like that. So we certainly appreciate the time. Again, the book is called The Secret Life of Groceries. There's more in it than we even talked about. And thank you for changing our perspective on something that we all take for granted.
Hey, total pleasure. Thanks for the great questions. I really appreciated the chat. It was really good.
Awesome.
Thanks, Benjamin.
All right, guys. I'll see you on the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So we appreciate your time and we'll stay in touch.
All right, man.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys.